Good morning, people. Down here on a chilly morning on the boat in the river, early December. Here we are. It's been a long time since I've posted any meaningful content other than my clickbaity kind of shorts. Sorry about that, but the fact is they do better than anything else I do to tickle the algorithm and create a certain amount of interest in the channel, so I'll probably persist with that. I encourage you to play my silly little game here and click on them if you would, because silly shots of deer in the wood can generate tens of thousands of views, and intelligent conversation um, generally generates tens of views. So again, to in an attempt to build our community here, just play along. But anyway, things are going well here in Vancouver. Obviously, this is a moment of interesting change. I've been spending a lot of time with my dad here over the last couple of months. He's intending to move into the city up here, at least part-time, get his own sailboat and take on the lifestyle. He's become pretty conversant in the same concerns that I hold. In fact, he brought up with him on the last trip Nouriel Roubini's last book, the most current one, which is Megathreats, and I spent some time reading it. I would recommend it to any of you if you are not really on page with kind of the state of affairs at current events. I mean, it's not a great book. One of the things that's interesting about it is that it is getting a fair amount of mainstream acclaim, even from big name mainstream people, which is interesting enough because these are concerns that I've probably been concerned with and talking about for 20 years. It's just that they have gone from the realm of the fringe to absolutely front and central among informed people. If you are late to that party, this would be a good book to catch up with, but it's relatively superficial and relatively popular. Even at that point, it startles most people who live simply within the algorithmic infomercial. But here we are. And if you want a deeper dive into things that you find there that are more interesting, he lists 10 of these mega threats. I would probably offer up another. We will get into that. But anyway, it would be a great way to catch up and get some perspective, okay? Now, of course, if you can't be bothered, and most of you won't be bothered, I will give you the quick Cliff Notes kind of synopsis, because none of this should really surprise any of you who follow my content. You know, his 10 mega threats are the usual suspects, right? They are going to be issues like debt to GDP ratios in most of the G20. They're going to be concerns about both population and demographics, of course. They're going to be the emergence of, right-wing fascism in a response to a global large-scale immigration and a trend towards isolationism and deglobalization, of course. Resource scarcity, which contributes to that, of course. The risk of large-scale conflict because, of course, all the above. Obviously, climate change is a major issue. Like, even the conservative reports are suggesting that by the end of this decade, you're going to see anywhere between 100 million to 250 million refugees moving about the world here, trying to flee scorched earth environs where they currently live. This kind of stuff. Okay. Obvious. So he has 10 of these. AI is another one. Massive disruptive things that are coming at us all together. And again, for individuals that live within the algorithmic bubble of privilege, they're not completely conspicuous, especially that many of us have not been touched personally, many of us, but more of us have every day. Okay. And while it can be comfortable to assume because it hasn't happened to you, it doesn't happen, there are more people in the club of the has happened than not every day. And Anyway, that beckons at the 11th megathreat, which I find of greater concern. And interestingly enough, of the 10 that Rubini gets at, he doesn't touch at the 11th. One of the problems with looking at Rubini's model, say, is that of his 10 megathreats, they are so gigantic and global in scale that the individual really is completely powerless to feel that they have any actionable strategy to change the course of events. And I would suggest that in reality the individual really does not. But the 11th megathreat, which I will suggest to you here in a moment, is one that a person has complete autonomy in terms of addressing. And it's interesting because the 11th megathreat is the engendering agent, in my opinion, behind the other 10. Now, this is the point in the conversation where I hear the protest from the usual suspects. It's like, well, you know, where do you get off thinking that you can project or predict the future? Like, no one can predict the future. The future is unknowable. Well, I think that's a very stupid thing to say. All of us predict the future, and generally do so quite accurately, really. And you know, I mean, after all, like, I've put a lot of time and effort into the art of navigation, and have inquired into that very deeply. And yes, there are people that predict the future extremely well, in fact. In fact, there are individuals who predict the future so well that they can hang, even at threat of death, their future on their predicting very accurately. So of course you predict the future. But the art of predicting is not like what many people think it is. Okay? It's not fortune telling. For example, let's say that you have your snazzy little car. All right? And I were to propose an experiment with you about predicting the future, whereby I drain all of the oil out of the engine and tell you to take a drive. And I predict that your engine will destroy itself. Why do I say that? Because all of the essential elements for an engine exploding are now present. That's objective. That's not an opinion. Now, of course, you could protest and say, I can't predict the future, if you expect me to tell you exactly at what instant and what milepost the thing throws a rod. Because I cannot do that. Because that is a function of a lot of chaotic and unknowable variables, right? But certainly we can objectively agree that all of the conditions for the engine falling apart are present. Just like if you look at the situation globally, you can see all of the characteristics for the collapse of civilization itself to be present. How that actually happens, what it sounds like when a piston goes right into the valve gang, I cannot tell you. But I can tell you that it's inevitable and it's going to happen because the pre-existing conditions are present. That is no different than how you predict the weather or predict all sorts of things with accuracy. It is purely a matter of observing that the essential conditions for change are fundamentally and objectively present. And in fact, perhaps opposed to observing that the fundamental conditions for stasis or lack of change are present. That's what prediction involves. Again, it's not fortune telling. And there's a degree of resolution that is credible and that which is incredible in the art of predicting the future. But yeah, you can predict the future, and it's often very obvious. Now, the question is whether or not you have the courage or the stomach or the intelligence or the actionability to face the conclusions of what you've observed. Well, that might be a really different thing. And I'm of the opinion that most people cannot. But that leads us into the discussion of the 11th megathreat, which I find to be most fundamental. So the 11th megathreat, the most important of the megathreats. What is that? Well, you get to that by wondering why we have the other 10 and why there is nothing we can do about it and why the expression of those other 10 is an inevitability. You get to discover that 11th when you get into that inquiry in a big way. Okay? And to cut to the chase, I would put it this way, and this is a view that comes not so much from systems dynamics, but psychology or philosophy. And it comes from asking the question as to why the mass of humanity chooses to relate to reality in a manner that is exploitive rather than constructive. Why is it that the mass of humanity, as we've talked much in the past, to use Buber's language, choose to relate in an objective I-it posture rather than the relational I-thou posture? Why is it that humanity chooses often violence over cooperation? Why? Not everyone, but most. And the most determines the trend. Why is that the case? Because there's no way to solve the inherent problems or the inherent conditions, for that matter, that create these other 10 megathreats unless there's a majority of individuals who choose to relate to life and reality as a constructive co-participant rather than a destructive exploiter. And the mass of humanity globally chooses to be a destructive exploiter. So why so? Well, there could be many explanations. I will offer mine. I think mine is more hopeful. If you get into the kind of psychology, say that maybe the Jungian psychology that was Jung's message towards the end of his life, I mean, his view was pretty apocalyptic. He had pretty well lost faith in the ability of humanity to do anything else. I would say that my views are probably, while very informed by that, are more aligned probably with the views of Ken Wilber or R.D. Laing, for that matter, or anyone who's worked in, I don't know, behavioral stuff or whatever. I see the tendency towards facing the world destructively or from a posture of violence to simply be a form or an expression of mental retardation of individuals that have gotten older but not grown up. I mean, in reality, in human society or primate society, the first tool to power that anybody encounters is violence. It's like you are injected into a world as this semi-conscious entity with a very myopic view of existence, and in fact, really the only way that your parents can interface with that, because at that point you are not even aware that your parents exist, is through some kind of quote-unquote violence. and you relate back to your parents by squalling and screaming and making them as uncomfortable as hell, which is violence. And it is, in fact, the baseline and the first skill that most human beings learn, if not all, in terms of interfacing with reality. And in fact, there's a certain kind of hostility that reality expresses to you, at least at some level, because of this necessary dynamic. What we should really ask ourselves is what causes some people to grow out of that. And the reason, I think, why most people do not grow out of this doesn't stem from essential qualities of human nature, but essential qualities of the global civilization that we inhabit, which in fact is predicated on destruction and exploitation. And this is, of course, why it is global and why it will be short-lived and stands in complete and utter contrast to the values and mores and ways of relating of the most persistent human cultures. Say, perhaps of the tribes here on my coast, or the Aboriginals, or such or so, many of which are documented now to have tens, perhaps, of millennia of continued habitation. This burp that we call industrial civilization looks, pretty green, right? But there's a diabolical systems design problem here. And that's this, that if you live within a culture where destruction and exploitation is affirmed, not only by financial reward or perhaps mate selection, you're going to create a short-lived society which dominates the entire world. Because of the short-term energetic rewards of that, you will outrun any other culture. Because you are, in fact, making a policy of killing the golden goose. While that's obviously foolish, you at least get more goose meat in the short run than your peers, and that allows you to go steal their geese too. So you have this dangerous set of circumstances where the most exploitive people end up being the most exploitive, and they end up being the most successful, quote unquote, within a destructive environment. There will always be people who have strong moral intelligence that will choose against that because they grow up more. But as today, especially perhaps today, they become more and more voiceless because the system itself elevates exploitive voices at the expense of constructive voices because the system is exploitive. This is troublesome because the average individual learns through emulation and mentorship. And if you've gone your entire life without ever interacting with other people who actually interact with you in a constructive, loving, I-thou manner, you've never seen it effectively demonstrated ever. And there's a strong chance of that. It would be completely natural to expect that the way that you live your life is a necessity. The average individual is simply not creative enough or intuitive enough to see another way of going about it. That's always been the case. And in fact, if their exposure to individuals that might be is even denied, well, again, these are preconditions that determine an inevitable result. Now, this also begs at why it is that I personally take exception with the kinds of strategies out there that one sees among, well, I'll just leave my adjective out. Individuals who are interested in, say, advocacy. Okay. Let's take the example of a organization like Extinction Rebellion in particular. Okay. Who seems to be operating under an idea that the public at large is unwilling to modify its behavior in order to embrace a survivable future because of ignorance. And that if they were forced to understand the circumstances which humanity faces right now, like if they were forced to understand that, they would change their behavior. And I disagree fundamentally, and for these reasons that I'm getting at right now. The average individual, even if they knew what was going on, and in fact most educated people do know, they still lack a viable model by which they would do anything about it. And that's primarily due to the fact that we live within a destructive environment where you have to actually be a destructive individual in order to survive. So to tell an individual that climate change is going to kill them and their kids in 40 years, but then ask them to give up a lifestyle which, in fact, really, if it was meaningful in terms of impact and change, would look like you were killing your kids today, well, anyone is going to take the choice of dying in the future rather than committing suicide today. And it looks that way to people because there is a conspicuous absence of individuals who have made the psychological change from living with a relationship towards reality, life, and other people destructively to constructively. There's really nothing out there whatsoever for anyone who even wanted to change their life to emulate, to try, and certainly nothing that looks very attractive. I mean, there are outfits that you do see, but a lot of them come across very cornball and woo, and a clever nose understands that many of them are motivated not by this I, thou posture. They just ape that lingo in order to virtue signal and con often young, attractive women into believing that they've got some vision for the future, right? A lot of times it comes across pretty scammy and not attractive. There is an incredible lack of credible people who are living credible, attractive, alternative lifestyles that demonstrate that it is possible, viable, to embrace a way of interacting with the world that is constructive and is a posture of being a constructive co-participant in life rather than being some kind of parasitic tick. And of the individuals out there who are doing so credibly, most of them are currently voiceless. Because again, the algorithm of civilization dominates the conversation and tells you what you should hear, and I guarantee alternatives are not in that interest. So what is the choice for the individual in order to face this inevitable future that we've created for ourselves? Well, it is precisely this. It is to proactively understand the dynamic that has created these megathreats, which is that having a hostile relationship with life and reality and other people, and to personally, even if it doesn't make immediate sense, to move towards a posture of embracing that I-thou relationship with life and reality, and to deliberately wed one's future to being a co-participant in the creative process of existence. That's what it means. And that is a choice against everything that you've ever been taught. But here's the deal, and I've been saying this for years. It is inevitable that the consequences of the choices that civilization have thus far made will come home to roost. It's inevitable. And eventually, the rewards that civilization offers you will no longer be present. You're going to lose that regardless. So why not now, proactively, move towards a lifestyle that embraces a constructive relationship with reality while you could still claim it was a choice and a virtue? And you could get some practice in living a lifestyle that was in harmony with reality, while if you screwed it up or made a bad choice, you could still probably find some mediocre compensation while you got better at it. You know, you want to certainly plant that garden well ahead of needing to rely on it, because if you screw it up and the beetles eat it, you could still order a pizza. Why not embrace the choice to live in a manner that you will eventually be forced to, but poorly, now, so you can do it well and constructively? Why not? Why not? So we could discuss that a little deeper. I've gone on almost 30 minutes now. That's going to give you a lot to chew on. Often the month of December, and especially around the solstice, is a time of reflection for me. I've kind of made that a practice, and to calibrate a little bit, or correct the course that I'm on. This is something I do this time of year. It's a good practice, so that will be on my mind over the next little bit. But let's try to consider and pursue the conversation. Thanks for listening. I'm eager to hear any of your feedback. Please participate. Especially as it's essential here, if any of us are going to move towards a survivable future or a creative, loving future, to do our best to avoid the inevitable crabs in the bucket phenomenon that is civilization. We don't have to live like crabs. Rather than pull each other down, let's be angels and lift each other up. The more we do that, the more that'll happen too. Cheers, people.